Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One aspect of friendship that Plutarch thinks is really essential, he even calls it the language of friendship at one point in his work, How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend, is what the Greeks called parrhesia, meaning frankness of speech, telling somebody what it is that they actually do need to hear because it's true and it might hurt their feelings a bit to hear it. So, there's some important issues involved with this. And you could say, well, the flatterer is not going to do that because they are simply going to give you pleasure, and frank speech doesn't give pleasure to the other person. It's often likened to medicine. So you can tell the flatterer from the friend because they don't engage in frank speaking. Well, it's not quite so simple as that. And Plutarch says there are certain ways in which a flatterer is going to imitate. They're going to engage in mimesis of frankness of speech. And he's got this really great analogy or metaphor, if you like. It's something, he says, like in Menander's comedy, the sham Hercules comes on carrying a club. That was Hercules, the hero's great weapon, which is not solid or strong, but soft, light, a hollow counterfeit, right? It lacks weight and firmness, he says, just like women's cushions, which while they seem to support and offer resistance to their heads, yield and give way to them. So I guess in the places where Plutarch was living, women used softer cushions than men did. And so how could fake frankness be like a fake club? Actually, the hollowness of it is kind of an interesting term here because he calls it diakenon, right? Kenos means vain, empty. It's the word that we get vainglory from, kenodoxia. And so imagine that the flatterer is going to use frankness, which is like this. It's sort of like throwing pumice stones at somebody when it looks like you're throwing real rocks at them. The pumice stones aren't going to actually hurt, or if they do, they'll hurt just a little bit. And so he talks about people having what he calls a pretense of harshness, or a parade of harshness, and being acrimonious and inexorable in their bearing with others. Now, who do they actually do this with? They are pretty harsh to somebody, but they're not harsh to their targets. They're harsh, as he says, to their own servants, to people who live within their house. So we might think less about servants and more about customer service workers or employees or people like that. Very quick to pounce on the errors of their kinsmen, their family, and their household, refusing to admire or extol any outsider, but despising all such, relentless in their efforts to stir up others to anger by their slanders. What are they actually trying to do? They're trying to get a reputation for themselves as a hater of iniquity or evil, as being, a straight shooter, a real critic. And it's interesting because the term that's used there is misokakia, right? A hatred, the opposite of friendship, of vice or bad things. Now, they're trying to get a reputation for this, but they're not really living up to it. And a lot of times they're going to be criticizing people for things that aren't really vicious. So they want to give the impression that they're not going to willingly hold off on their frankness to please others or do or say anything to curry favor. Why? Because that way they can appear not to be a flatterer. So this is one of the tricks that flatterers are going to use in giving criticism that isn't really criticism. And then Plutarch identifies another aspect of this. This, I think, we can all relate to. It's a sort of misdirection, and he gives lots of examples of this. The criticism is not targeted at the real issues, but instead at other matters. So he says, this person pretends not to know or notice a single real or important misdeed, but they're quick to swoop down on trifling and immaterial shortcomings and indulge in an intense and vehement tirade if they see, for example, a bit of furniture is carelessly placed, if they see a person as a poor manager, if anyone's careless about having their hair cut, they don't give proper care to some dog or horse. So these are minor things, right? But let a person disregard their parents. Big thing for the ancient Greeks. Neglect their children, another big thing. Insult their wife, disdain their household, squander their money. All this is nothing to him, but in the midst of such matters, he is mute. He doesn't say anything. So criticizing small, trivial, inconsequential things, not focusing on the real, serious lapses or issues. And he talks about, here's the examples. A trainer who allows an athlete to get drunk and live loosely, but is stern about olive flask and flesh scraper. Now, what does that refer to? They used to clean themselves with oil. You'd put oil on yourself and then you'd scrape it off, and that would get rid of the dirt and dead skin and stuff like that. What should the athletic trainer actually be concerned with? The things that are much more important. A schoolmaster who scolds a boy about his slate and pencil, but doesn't hear his blunders in grammar and diction. The schoolmaster should be concerned with making sure the student is actually learning properly, getting rid of mistakes, not worrying about trivial matters like that. So, he gives you more examples, but I think you see the general idea there. This is a psychological technique that the flatterer can use to seem to be giving frank speech to his target, but not really doing so. And the target might be like, whew, I'm glad they didn't see my real problems, right? Now, there's also a third thing that he's going to talk about, misusing frankness of speech and blame or criticism to give pleasure to other people. So, what is this like? This is when we see people making fun of others, and they are saying things perhaps that are true, but they're doing it in a mean-spirited way, a malicious way. Like he says, Agus the Argive, on an occasion when Alexander gave great gifts to a jester, in jealousy and chagrin, shouted out, "Heavens, what gross absurdity!" And Alexander said, "What's that you say?" And he said, "I confess I feel troubled and indignant at seeing that all you sons of Zeus show favor to flatterers and ridiculous persons," right? And so he says, you can see such persons are in good repute with you. So he's kind of joking around. So, this is probably something, that we should attend to as well. But then we come to what Plutarch is going to say is a much deeper, more significant issue. So these other three are not great, but there's a deeper problem. And he talks about using criticism, frank speaking, that is directed against the emotions, the pathe, and the defects or illnesses, the nosemata. Gnosis is something that is wrong with us. It could be our body. The Greeks also talked about illnesses of the soul, right? So vices that we have, bad complexes, responses to trauma that lead us astray. Criticism that is aimed not at what is wrong with the person, but at the opposite of what is wrong with the person. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, it sends the message to the person that they're actually a lot better off than they think they are, and it encourages them to indulge these bad parts of themselves. So he says that Himerus the flatterer used to vilify a person, the most illiberal and avaricious of the rich people at Athens, as a careless profligate destined to starve miserably with his children. So somebody who's greedy, stingy, doesn't want to let go of stuff would say, oh, you are so profligate, you're a spendthrift, you're not going to leave anything left for your kids. It's targeting a vice, so that's kind of good, but it's targeting the opposite vice of what the person has. So it makes the person feel like, oh, well, I'm not doing that thing, so I must be doing a good thing over here. He gives some other examples. They will reproach profligate and lavish spenders with meanness and sordidness, being penny pinchers. And he gives an example. Titus Petronius did this with Nero. Even worse, I would say. They will bid rulers who are savage and fierce with their subjects to lay aside their excessive clemency or mercy and their unprofitable pity. Why are you taking it so easy on those people? You say this to somebody who isn't taking it easy, but is actually too aggressive, too demanding, too mean to people. And he goes on and on with other examples of this. He talks about love affairs. With regard to love affairs, they beset their victims and add fuel to their fire. If they see that any are in disagreement with their brothers, or that they treat their parents badly or deal scornfully with their wives, they don't admonish or arraign them. They don't say, hey, what are you doing, man? That's the bad behavior there. You shouldn't be treating your parents like that. You shouldn't be treating your spouse like that. You shouldn't be treating your sibling like that. Instead, they say, why are you taking it so easy on them? What is wrong with you? You need to stand up for yourself against these other people. And what are they doing? They're encouraging the worst instincts, the worst sides, the worst habits of these people who they're engaging in seeming frankness, but really flattery. And Plutarch is going to go on and talk a little bit later about the mechanism by which this works. So he's going to tell us that we really need to think about our psychology. And so now this is going to Plutarch's Platonism. Plutarch thinks that we, within our, whatever you want to call it, psyche, personality, soul, we have a rational higher part, and then we have an irrational, more emotional lower part, which isn't necessarily bad, but definitely is irrational. And to have a good life, we need to have sort of an ordering where the rational part is doing its job and the irrational parts are cooperating with it. And, if you've read Plato's Republic, you're probably familiar with this tripartite model. The two lower parts are the irrational part. So he says we need to keep in mind that our soul has two sides. A rational side, on which side is truthfulness, love for what is honorable, the power to reason, and on the other side, irrationality, love of falsehood, and the emotional element. And a friend is going to be, in general, helping us out with the rational side. Doesn't mean that we don't have emotions involved, but those emotions are going to be governed by reason. What is the flatterer doing? And how does that play into this dynamic or trick that we saw with imitation of frankness? Well, the flatterer, as he says, doesn't add anything to the reasoning powers, but instead encourages emotions, vices, sicknesses, all the ways in which we go wrong. And he says that this is sort of like food that is not good for the blood or the breath, adds no vigor to nerves or marrows, but just excites the lower passions, arouse the appetite, and make unsound flesh that is morbid within. So junk food, right? The flatterer is the equivalent of junk food. And he says that this is tricky for us. Why? Because our emotions do get involved and get riled up and get encouraged by these flatterers, it becomes difficult for us to detect the flattery while it's happening. Why? Because, our power to reason is actually affected by the vehemence, sfodroteta, onset, the ability of these emotions to grip us, and their strength or their magnitude, their megathos, their intensity, right? So when we feel things like anger, jealousy, rivalry with other people, it's easy for us to be tricked by flatterers who are seemingly being straight with us, but are actually steering us into worse states of character. He says the flatterer throws their weight on our worse inclinations, and because of that, they are, banishing our bad feelings about this. It's translated here as feeling of mortification, feeling like we've done something wrong, right? Our sense of shame is a better way of translating it. An aischounontes, right? So aischos is going to be shame, and the lack of shame, embarrassment. We don't realize that we're actually becoming worse, doing wrong as a result. So it's not just the case that those who imitate frankness of speech are, taking the place of real friends or something like that. They can actually be quite damaging to us. The flatterers who pretend to be telling us what's wrong with our conduct, our character, our motivations, but who really aren't, who are encouraging us thereby to become worse people. Quite dangerous to us. And that's why Plutarch wants to place us on guard against counterfeit frankness of speech.